Bueno, buenas tardes a todas i a todos, bona tarda a tothom. Benvinguts a aquesta sessió, una ciutat que garanteix els drets culturals. Esta sesión la vamos a hacer en castellano, esencialmente para facilitar las labores de traducción. Y esta sesión, sobre todo, lo que trata es de abrir un espacio para la reflexión colectiva, si es posible, sobre la interrelación entre lo que es el espacio público, la ciudad, la cultura, desde la perspectiva de los derechos culturales. Y antes que nada quiero dar la bienvenida a nuestros ponentes en esta sesión y agradecerles que estén aquí, agradeceros también a vosotros, los participantes que estáis aquí y los que estáis online. Como veis, aquí no estamos nosotros dos, hay otros ponentes más, pero voy a pasar un poco a introducir a los ponentes y después empezaremos también con la sesión, con las experiencias y las aportaciones. Primero, aquí a mi lado, aquí en el lujo de tener la presencia física de alguien, es Diego Peris, es arquitecto y miembro del colectivo Todo por la Praxis. Es un colectivo multidisciplinar de arquitectos, diseñadores y artistas que están en Madrid. Vienen de Madrid especialmente para esta sesión. Gracias, Diego. En la pantalla, no sé si podemos mostrarlos ya, estará Mirik Milan. Mirik Milan es un consultor sobre vida nocturna y fue el primer alcalde nocturno de una ciudad, de la ciudad de Ámsterdam. O sea, considerando que la ciudad por la noche también tiene vida y por lo tanto también necesita un alcalde que de alguna manera ayude a gobernar esa ciudad por la noche. Tenemos también a Amara, welcome, desde Chicago. Ella es estratega, ella es profesional de la innovación social, también del impacto social, y es una experta en políticas públicas urbanas y coordinadora de políticas de investigación del movimiento Black Lives. Y sé que ha estado luchando en una campaña electoral ahora o recientemente por la alcaldía de Chicago. Si me equivoco, me corriges, Amara. Y después hay un cambio de programa. Teníamos previsto a Mark David, pero Mark no ha podido venir, tenía que venir presencialmente, pero está indispuesto. Pero en su lugar tenemos también una persona de la misma organización, Clara Cullen, que es directora de apoyo de las salas de Music Venue Trust, que sobre todo actúan específicamente para proteger, asegurar, mejorar, apoyar a los locales de música de base. Y desde allí gestiona el servicio de crisis de estos locales. Además, está coordinando la labor política de Music Venue Trust. También ella es una activista, están trabajando con metodologías que se llaman agentes para el cambio. Nos hablará luego un poquito de todo esto. Un poco para introducir esta conversación y dar un marco, lo que queremos aquí es de alguna manera compartir las experiencias, las consideraciones que puedan ser útiles para desplegar a través de ejemplos muy concretos, todo por la praxis, Agents for Culture, lo que se está haciendo desde Chicago, la alcaldía nocturna de Ámsterdam. Pues a través de esos ejemplos concretos lo que queremos es, de alguna manera, evidenciar, buscar cuáles son las potencialidades de incluir la cultura y los derechos culturales en el desarrollo de las ciudades. Desde el convencimiento que creo que compartimos casi todos los que estamos en esta mesa, que la cultura es clave para la recuperación y sobre todo después de la después de la crisis COVID, una recuperación que tiene que estar centrada sobre todo en las personas y en el desarrollo sostenible. Sí, es verdad que la cultura ha sido uno de los sectores más afectados por la crisis del COVID, pero queremos también ampliar un poco la mirada, que no sea esto un debate estrictamente sectorial, sino que de alguna manera se analice cómo se pueden promover desde la práctica cultural el acceso de la cultura, la participación, la diversidad, la gobernanza de la cultura, junto con temas como la movilidad, la migración, la diversidad, la inclusión, incluso el turismo, que podría ser uno de los temas a tratar. Y más allá de este enfoque sectorial, como os decía, esas prácticas culturales explican el mundo, pero también deconstruyen ese mundo, los privilegios, las exclusiones, el poder, la historia mismo, el patrimonio, cuál es el patrimonio del que nos dotamos, cuál es el que dejamos al lado. Pero sobre todo la cultura también actúa sobre las personas, sobre las comunidades, sobre los movimientos sociales y sobre las esferas políticas y económicas. Y, por lo tanto, creemos que esta inclusión de ese vector, que no tanto un sector, pero sí del vector de la cultura, de la dimensión cultural en todas las políticas urbanas, es fundamental. En definitiva, esto es un poco lo que vamos a tratar de explorar en esta sesión. De nuevo, repito, cómo garantizar esos derechos culturales en las ciudades y situar a la cultura en el centro del desarrollo local, incluyendo también la perspectiva de los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible, las estrategias de esa palabra tremenda que se llama resiliencia, los planes de igualdad, etc. Vamos a empezar un poco de lo más concreto a lo más abstracto, a lo más político, y me gustaría empezar con Diego. Diego, todo por la praxis, en principio, planteáis nuevos modos de producción de ciudad. Eso es lo que decís. Y sobre todo trabajáis a través de urbanismo táctico, proyectos de coproducción, proyectos de resiliencia, etcétera, pero sobre todo basados en las prácticas colaborativas y en la participación. En ese sentido, la participación ciudadana es clave en vuestros procesos. Y a mí me gustaría, también trabajáis en temas de pedagogías, aprendizajes colectivos, etcétera. ¿Cómo relacionáis un poco esta cultura, espacio público, planificación urbana desde el punto de vista de vuestras prácticas en todo por la praxis?
Bueno, pues hay como varios puntos, porque lo que es un poco como la práctica nosotros estamos trabajando, o sea, lo planteamos desde las prácticas colaborativas, trabajemos en el espacio público, trabajamos en los espacios comunes o trabajemos en diferentes contextos y diferentes situaciones. Eso es como la metodología y la herramienta un poco que nos va como guiando. La cuestión un poco cuando ya aterriza en el espacio público, pues nos confrontamos un poco a otros elementos que de alguna manera determinan esta cuestión del espacio público. Porque el espacio público, o sea, pues tiene como unos condicionantes, o sea, a priori, donde se marcan unas normativas, se marcan como unas regulaciones y también se marcan como unas maneras de participar, que muchas veces tienes que ir como gestionando, o sea, o tienes que ir como negociando pues con administraciones públicas en el caso de poder hacer una intervención dentro de un espacio público, o sea, la que sea, ¿no? Porque nosotros en este caso pues planteamos estas operaciones, como tú cuentas, de urbanismo táctico, que en muchas veces estamos como en coordinación con alguna administración pública y en coordinación con algún agente social, a una asociación de vecinos, una iniciativa ciudadana concreta, donde se plantea un desarrollo de una acción o una intervención específica. Te digo que es diferente porque, lógicamente, si nosotros trabajamos en un espacio común, la negociación es diferente que si trabajamos en un espacio público, porque el espacio común es un espacio que gestiona una comunidad, un recurso común, que no es lo mismo que trabajar con una negociación con un recurso público, ¿no? Que ahí hay como un marco, o sea, como un matiz muy importante que nos diferencia un poco de esta cuestión. Nosotros, en algunos casos, hemos hecho, para intentar un poco cómo ejemplificar esto, hemos trabajado como en espacios o en entornos como existen aquí en Barcelona también, solares, huertos urbanos y demás, donde se construyen y se definen, o sea, como el desarrollo de un proyecto, de una infraestructura de gestión ciudadana. Pero claro, eso está bajo una cesión de un espacio a unas entidades concretas, donde ellos deciden cómo se organiza ese espacio con unas gobernanzas específicas y con unos planteamientos muy concretos. Si vamos al espacio público, en este caso, o sea, nos vamos como a otro tipo de normativa que se rige por las normativas y ordenanzas municipales o por la regulación un poco que existe dentro del propio planeamiento urbanístico, o sea, donde te van limitando cosas concretas que puedes o no hacer dentro del espacio público. Nosotros, además, nos interesa muchas veces transgredir y hackear esas cosas tanto en un lado como en otro, ¿no? O sea, que nos planteamos un poco como esa herramienta o esa manera de operar porque pues bueno, nos gusta cuestionar como muchos de esos límites o muchos de los elementos que definen, o sea, las propias normativas, las propias ordenanzas, porque quizá muchas veces nos plantea como una revisión un poco de esos marcos, ¿no? De esos marcos reguladores que pensamos que siempre hay que cuestionarlos, ¿no? O sea, y en este caso, nosotros, por ejemplo, hemos hecho como un proyecto en Madrid que es Cine Mousera, es un cine al aire libre que no está en un solar, o sea, está en un espacio público estrictamente, o sea, y planteamos un poco una intervención, o sea, y con esto intentaré como ejemplificar cómo se hacen estos hackeos, planteamos una intervención pues de habilitar un espacio público para una gestión ciudadana. Esto habitualmente, aunque parezca como sencillo, no es posible normativamente, porque para poder hacer esto, o sea, prácticamente tienes que tener como unas licencias de actividad que te puedas un poco desarrollar actividad dentro del espacio público. Si quieres hacer una actividad cultural, la que sea, tienes que tener unas licencias de ocupación o de actividad de un espacio público para un evento concreto en un marco muy concreto de tiempo. Este caso era un marco de tiempo ampliado. Este cine de verano es un cine que ha durado 6 años de funcionamiento, que gestionan varias entidades vecinales del barrio, varias entidades culturales del barrio, y no existe ningún instrumento dentro de las políticas públicas para que eso se habilite, ¿no? Como que se habilite como ese canal, o no existía hasta el momento, ¿no? Como que se habilite esa posibilidad de una gestión de un espacio, o sea, que en realidad es público, pero que lo gestiona unas entidades sociales. Aquí lo que se planteó era como abrir como una licencia de actividad, vamos a llamarlo como de tarifa plana, una licencia de actividad de uso extendido, pero se convirtió en este uso extendido bajo una excepcionalidad. Prácticamente nadie hasta el momento había usado esta figura en todo el Ayuntamiento de Madrid, nadie hasta este momento había planteado como esa posibilidad, y se negocia con la Administración un poco esta cesión de uso que año a año se va intentando como renovar y negociar dentro de un marco de tiempo que se define que son 3 meses, pues dentro del marco de tiempo del verano. Con esto un poco hubiese sido muy diferente, o sea, lo intentaba ejemplificar para contraponer un poco a lo que sería una gestión de uso de un espacio, pues de un común urbano, de un solar, ¿no? Si hubiese habido como una cesión, las cesiones sí que tienen otros marcos ya regulados y donde ya se puede un poco plantear esta posibilidad. En el espacio público no existía o no ha existido todavía como un trabajo en este sentido, ¿no? O sea, ahora mismo nosotros un poco también, cuando nos planteamos un poco como el debate y cuando se plantea un poco dentro un poco de este contexto de plantearnos el espacio público después del COVID, también nos preguntamos un poco al resto de ponentes qué se está haciendo en este sentido, ¿no? Nosotros mismos nos preguntamos porque prácticamente hay como una necesidad o hay como de replantearse cuál es el papel del espacio público dentro de esos derechos, pero qué se está haciendo por diferentes canales, en este caso también por la Administración pública, para que eso se posibilite. Porque en la práctica no existe esa posibilidad. O sea, por lo menos un poco en términos normativos tienes que pasar por otros canales que son mucho más rígidos y prácticamente es imposible, o sea, desarrollar proyectos de este tipo dentro de espacio público, ¿no? O sea, salvo que pases por las licencias, permisos de actividad, etcétera, ¿no? Que tienen como temporalidades muy específicas y que te restringen a formatos muy concretos, ¿no? O sea, y a esto también lo enlazamos un poco con las propias gobernanzas, ¿no? Porque también un poco dices, bueno, ¿cómo encaja esto con las prácticas colaborativas? Las prácticas colaborativas, de alguna manera, o sea, lo que nos están planteando es una toma de decisión conjunta. Dentro de esa toma de decisión conjunta hay una cierta horizontalidad donde todos planteamos, decidimos, construimos, codiseñamos, nos repensamos, o sea, y cuestionamos temas que nos interesan a un común, que nos hemos un poco como interpelado a unas cuestiones concretas para desarrollar un proyecto específico. Ese mismo planteamiento, si nosotros nos estamos planteando una negociación con una administración pública que no permite construir una relación y unas gobernanzas en ese común, prácticamente estamos limitando esa posibilidad, ¿no? O sea, estamos limitando la posibilidad a canalizarlo bajo unos formatos muy concretos y prácticamente, pues bueno, la negociación es bilateral, como quien dice, o es de caras concretas, entidades concretas, y de hecho hay entidades que, hablando un poco de esto hablando un poco como de estos marcos culturales, hay entidades que no tienen ni entidad jurídica, con la que no se puede negociar con una administración, ¿no? Si no tienes como esa entidad jurídica, muchas veces no hay un reconocimiento de un otro, ¿no? De cara a la negociación. Por lo tanto, estás fuera, ¿no? Entonces hay muchas situaciones que nos quedamos fuera de esas posibilidades, o sea, de construir bajo un común. Y la administración tampoco, le pasa un poco lo mismo, no tiene herramientas para construir como marcos o instrumentos donde construir como una toma de decisiones conjuntas. En el cine Mousera, por ejemplo, nosotros se estaba planteando hacer una programación por la ciudadanía, ¿no? La ciudadanía programaba su cine, o sea, programaba sus contenidos, programaba sus actividades, y no era el centro cultural el que te llevaba una programación específica que te decía exactamente lo que vas a consumir o los contenidos que se van a producir. En este caso, los propios ciudadanos se autoorganizan y deciden, o sea, de una manera coordinada, bajo unas plataformas, bajo unas asambleas, había como unos instrumentos que se habían desarrollado. Pero, otra vez más, bajo un marco de excepcionalidad y bajo como un hackeo que se plantea un poco dentro de este proyecto, ¿no? Y bueno, con esto, o sea, yo creo que por aquí os he puesto un par de ejemplos para intentar un poco cómo acercarme y seguiremos un poco contando en las siguientes.
Pues gracias, Diego. Yo creo que está muy bien, estaría muy bien después que... Bueno, ya se ha explicado bastante claramente la diferencia entre el espacio público y el espacio común, tal y como lo planteáis desde todo por la praxis y desde la práctica, en realidad. Y también esta especie como de tensión que tenéis entre, por un lado, la gobernanza del espacio y de los espacios comunes y, por el otro lado, las regulaciones de los espacios públicos. Yo creo que esto nos lleva bastante adelante, sobre todo porque las prácticas culturales tienden a tensionar, precisamente, esas relaciones, las prácticas culturales y sociales, sobre todo cuando ocupan el espacio público. Ahora me gustaría dar un poco dar la palabra a Clara Cullen. Clara, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Como os decía, thank you. Estáis utilizando el principio de agentes de cambio para ayudar a proteger específicamente locales de música de base en toda la planificación, en el desarrollo urbano. Entonces, nos gustaría que nos introdujeras un poco a qué hay detrás de la metodología de Agents for Change y del desarrollo de las comunidades locales, las posibilidades que esta metodología tiene para el desarrollo de las comunidades locales.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As you can see, I'm not Mark David. Mark is ill with a sore throat, and I'm not too far behind him. So if I start coughing, I do apologise. In my role at NVT, I'm the venue support manager. And what that means is at Music Venue Trust, we're a UK charity with the aims of protecting, securing and improving grassroots music venues here in the UK. And when I joined Music Venue Trust in 2017, I joined halfway through our Agent of Change campaign. And now the Agent of Change campaign was probably the first big campaign we ever did as a charity. And the principle is quite easy to understand, and I think something that most people would agree with, which is if you are a development and you're moving into an area where there are existing businesses, you as the developer are what we refer to as the agent of change. And within the planning process in the UK, the agent of change principle means that the local councils have to take into account the fact that these developments are moving into an area with existing businesses, such as music venues. And at that point in the planning process, really they need to get to the developers to implement policies, sound mitigation measures, soundproofing, things like that, so that if the development is granted planning permission, they are acknowledged as the agent of change. They have to implement measures within their own development processes to mitigate the fact that they are the agent of change. And we thought this was quite a simple principle that most people could understand. We actually followed the model in Australia. They were the first country to explore the agent of change principle, and we took a lot of expertise from them in this campaign. And in my role as the venue support manager, often music venues will ask me to make representations on their behalf within the planning system, and Music Venue Trust will write a planning comment, and we use Agent of Change in every comment that we do. We stress it in our comments, and I think probably in the UK the most important thing to realise, people don't always realise, is that Agent of Change is not legislation. So it's not in the law, it's not part of the law, it's just a planning recommendation. So it's in what we call the National Planning Policy Framework, and local councils have to consider it as a recommendation, but it isn't yet law. We are undergoing massive planning reform in the UK, so it might become law, we don't know yet. But as a principle, it's been really important to what we do. It's been really important to venue to sort of as an idea. And so now with this principle, if a music venue is threatened by development, the responsibility to protect that venue from those negative outcomes, whether they be licensing or trading hours or operation or future noise complaints, that falls with the developer, and council can use agents of change as a way to make sure that those consequences and those mitigations are implemented.
Muchas gracias, Clara. Muy claro, me parece, es una metodología, bueno, una campaña interesante para trabajar el tema de las gobernanzas, de las actividades culturales. Aprovechando esto, le doy la palabra ahora a Mirik. Mirik, tu trabajo como alcalde nocturno, nos gustaría que nos contaras sobre eso, pero también quiero decir que es una figura que ha sido replicada en Londres, en Nueva York. A mí me gustaría que nos compartieras con nosotras cuál es el programa que desarrollaste, cuáles eran los objetivos del programa, cuáles fueron los éxitos, las dificultades, porque estuviste como 4 años, ¿no? 4 o 5 años ejerciendo de alcalde nocturno. Y no sé si se mantiene la figura de alcalde nocturno todavía en Ámsterdam.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay, just nod if that's okay. So, hi, my name is Mirik Milan. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I was the night mayor of Amsterdam for 6 years. And what I think is mostly important when we're looking at the city and who has the cultural right to the city is that music has been a driver for music has been a driver for cultural expression and social change for such a long time. And nightlife is very often demonized. We really believe that a vibrant nighttime economy can lead to a more culturally diverse and social inclusive city. And that's why we think it's so important to fight for these topics. After I came away of my role as the night mayor of Amsterdam, which I did for 6 years, we started a purpose-driven consultancy called Vibe Lab. With this consultancy, we're trying to really help and support cities establishing the role of the night mayor, but also looking at how can we support communities. I would like to talk to you a little bit more about what I've done in the recent years and how that could maybe be helpful in cities recovering. But I would like to take one step back and that is addressing why nightlife is important to cities. And we believe that at night the most progressive, open-minded and forward-thinking people come together. And this is really a place where people exchange and also develop their talents. When I speak about nightlife or music, like it's often we speak about cultural relevant nightlife that really impacts the cities and shapes the identity of a city as well. And in these music venues and nightclubs, there's a lot of talent being developed for the creative industry. And because think about it, like it's all the, it's photographers, filmmakers, of course the DJs, the VJs, and of course the live musicians that perform on stage. They all get the opportunity to develop their talent from grassroots level. That's where they find their voice. It's where they develop their fan base, and it's really where they build their talent. And that is also something that's also my personal story of organizing events and or organizing events as a 20-year-old boy. Didn't really know what I want to do. I started organizing parties, and in the end, I had a daytime job in the creative industry. And we believe that when there's a lot of creativity happening, and when there's a lot of creative spaces, this will also make sure that the city is more attractive for investment. But that's also the biggest challenge. And the agents of change was mentioned before, and I think that's a really powerful tool. Mostly because, and that is, I think, what is the real issue with our cities nowadays, is that the business models of cities is actually working against the creative community and all the spaces they run. Because the business model of a city is to develop the land, to increase the land price, and to cover, of course, all the costs that, and to cover the budget that needs to be done. But this really works against these creative communities and creative spaces that really give color to our cities and make our cities diverse and attractive in the first place for people to go there. So that's of course a challenge that many cities around the world are facing. And that is also something that we think it's important. So that's, for example, why we have developed a project called the Creative Footprint. And the Creative Footprint is a nightlife impact study that really calculates the amount of creative space a city has. Because we hope that cities in the future will make more decisions, not based on the amount of money they can earn by developing the grant and by developing the land, or giving it as a short-term short-term lease to a creative community, or and for them to develop it, and then in the end that they are the victims of their own success. So that's really a way how we approach a city, and really we also hope, that of course the economic impact is very important, but it's really also important to look at what is the cultural impact that the creative communities have on cities. When it comes to COVID and the impact of COVID, one of the things that went really well in Amsterdam in the last, or in the Netherlands in the last years, was the field lab research, where we researched how many people could go into a music venue, into a festival, into a space, and everyone was tested at the beginning, and everyone had to test afterwards, and that gave us a really good idea on how we could organize events safely. This approach has been used now in many cities in Europe for opening up. Luckily, nightlife and music festivals have been started up again and are happening, and of course we're happy that the vaccine is working and the levels stay low, the cases stay low. What we have done personally is we created a global nighttime recovery plan. That's a project that we worked on with more than 150 people in the last year and a half. I encourage you to download it. It's for free. You can find it on nighttime.org. The Global Nighttime Recovery Plan addresses a lot of different issues that were COVID related. It really spoke about how to use public space, but it also looked in what is the future of our dance floors. How do we make them more inclusive? How to create more opportunities for people that want to start a business, but also how can we protect these vulnerable spaces from being run out of business. We also looked at, what is how's the 24-hour city and how's public transport looked at. How can we make that more accessible for everyone? But we also looked at, okay, how can you set up an office of nightlife or night mayor? So we created a little toolkit for cities that are thinking, well, we have also the same issues of the disturbance at night at one hand, but also the importance of having this vibrant scene in your city. We are closing off this 7-chapter recovery plan with a chapter that is really focusing on measuring the impact of the nighttime sector, and really also to destigmatize nightlife and try to look at it in a different way. I know, of course, that the city of Barcelona has a lot of issues with nightlife activity, but it's also one of the biggest drivers for tourism. And how we can bring those two things in a balance is not something that should be organized by either. Let me rephrase. What I see happening in many cities around the world, we have consulted over more than 30 cities in the last 2 years about how to set up the role of the night mayor. And what I really often see is that a city says, okay, there's an issue at night, and we are now let the nightlife operators or the operators of hospitality deal with this issue directly with the city residents. And I really think that the city is the biggest beneficiary of vibrant nightlife and tourism, for the reasons that I explained before, because of course they have the benefit from when the land prices go up. So they should also step in and take their role and invest money into making sure that there's possibilities for music venues and nightclubs to operate, but also to minimize the issues for city residents. The city of Amsterdam has done that in a very progressive way. The former mayor of Amsterdam, which I worked with, he invested heavily in making sure that in the nightlife districts, that the reports of nuisance and alcohol-related violence went down significantly. We reduced alcohol-related violence by 20%, and the reports of nuisance went down by just over 30%. So for many city residents, that's an impact that is very welcome, and that's something we really have to look at. So just a little view on the future when it comes to COVID. We believe that many retail spaces will largely that retail will largely stay online. People are so used to now to buying stuff online, and also there will be less need for office space as well. In the short term, we hope that cities will think about new opportunities for these spaces to be utilized. Definitely when it comes to high streets. High streets is a big issue in many cities around the world. That they lose a lot of footfall. So it's important to find new opportunities for these spaces to be either temporarily or in the long term being used. I think cities also need to look at because there's a missed opportunity. Like the last two years, there were a lot of creative talent that weren't able to develop their talents. So we need to think about education opportunities. But also I think it's really important that we look at the tendency that a lot of music venues are booking also local talent, and we need to make sure that these talents also, when travel comes back, that these talents will stay on the top of the headline. So investing in local talent and nurturing local talent is something which is very important for us pushing forward. And the last point before I will round up now, and the last point which is really important is that also city governments acknowledge that the communities they are focusing on, definitely when it comes to marginalized communities. I see a lot of mayors around the world. They often say, yeah, we invest fully in youth, we want to create opportunities for them. But what they often forget is that where these young people or these minority groups want to come together in these music venues or nightlife spaces, that they are very much under pressure. So if you acknowledge that it's important to give them possibilities, then also acknowledge how important it is to have many of these creative incubators, nightlife venues or music venues. So thank you for that moment. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Mirik. Muchas gracias. Has hecho todo un panorama bastante que refleja lo que es la complejidad de la vida nocturna en las ciudades y sobre todo después de intentar compaginar la vida nocturna de las ciudades con la recuperación postpandemia, porque esto es uno de los temas que queremos tratar luego a posteriori en la conversación. Y luego también has tocado un tema que es importante, que es el tema de la gentrificación. Cuando hablamos de espacios públicos y hablamos de comunidades y de proyectos comunes y de gobernanzas comunes, me gustaría también tocarlo después, recuperar esa idea de la gentrificación, de esa especie de tensión que hay siempre entre la vida cultural y la vida artística y lo que ocurre en los barrios donde esta actividad sucede, sobre todo. Aymara, ahora me gustaría invitarte a ti a participar. Tú tienes una perspectiva mucho desde la ciudad y hablas, en tu página web he visto un vídeo tuyo que comentabas que las políticas públicas y urbanas no deberían enfocarse solo a la resolución de los problemas, sino que también tienen que tener una visión de ciudad, de cómo la ciudad puede llegar a ser, de cuáles son sus posibilidades. Y en tu experiencia en la política municipal y desde tu experiencia como experta en política pública, ¿Cómo te planteas estos derechos culturales? Específicamente el derecho a que la cultura sea diversa, por ejemplo. Mirik estaba hablando también del mantenimiento de la diversidad, de la importancia del mantenimiento de la diversidad diversa, participativa, equitativa. ¿Cuál crees que es el papel de las políticas, de los derechos culturales en la configuración de las políticas urbanas? Sobre todo respecto a la mirada de futuro que estás proponiendo, ¿no? De no mirar solo al hoy, sino mirar también a lo que puede llegar a ser una ciudad.
You're on mute still.
Oh, in this Zoom era. Thank you for that reminder, Mirik. And I was just thinking the panelists, I've learned so much from what you've shared and have really enjoyed just kind of hearing how you're making adjustments in this era. I was going to say post-COVID, but clearly we're not post-COVID yet. But also thank you to the conveners for this gathering, which I think is incredibly important. And to the question from a public policy standpoint and this notion of what it takes to guarantee cultural rights, what it means in a city, in cities, especially considering the diverse populations, diverse socioeconomic backgrounds and the like. And so there are a few points that I just want to highlight from this conversation that I think will help guide all of us who are in this space as we envision what life can be like, given our experiences over the last couple of years. And so one of the first things that I would like to share is this notion of seeing culture as it relates to cities, at least, as an ecosystem, as opposed to a unitary thing. And by ecosystem, I mean that culture includes large-scale venues. So when you think about museums and you think about concert halls or music venues, but it also includes small venues. It includes individual artists that are not necessarily connected to those large venues. It includes informal gatherings where culture is experienced in various ways, whether in music or in performing arts or in painting or sculpture. There's so many different components when we say culture. And sometimes I think when cities are planning, they tend to flatten culture to focus just on the museums that bring the most number of tourists each year. And while that is important, but I think it does a disservice to really understanding how rich a cultural environment is for a city and all that entails. So I think one of the biggest things that we have to do is really see culture in all of its diversity, first and foremost. And then to really see the cultural sector as an ecosystem where you have large, small collaborations, individuals all together. Because when we view it in that frame, then the solutions and the proposals and the opportunities can also reflect that framing, which I think is incredibly important. The other reason why I think that is important is because there are implications for cities around the work of being in the cultural space. And so generically, we could call it the workforce component of culture. And what we saw in COVID, we definitely have seen it in Chicago, but I'm sure this is the trend everywhere else, is it became very clear that there are so many individuals and folks who work in the cultural space that they're sole proprietorships. They work individually from job to job. They're freelancers, or they have a hybrid setup. And so the question becomes, how do we make sure not just that our major cultural institutions are okay and are operating, but how do we make sure that these individual artists, these creators, can be self-sustaining, even with the challenges where people are not necessarily coming out to events the way that they were prior to the pandemic. And that actually exposed a lot of, I think, realities that we have sort of taken for granted. Those of us who are, like myself, not incredibly artistic, but enjoy the arts, we show up. We go to the exhibits, we go to the open mic nights, we go to the poetry slams, but we don't necessarily know that life from the lens of a creator. And many of these individuals, many of these cultural creators find themselves in positions where they have to work multiple jobs. They're not just living off of their art, even if they, that's the ideal, right? But many of them were working in what we call essential workers. So many of them are working in restaurants, they're working in bars, they're working, in all of these other workforce areas that were affected by the pandemic. And so when we think from a policy standpoint for the city, how do we make sure that these individuals are also okay, that they do have some kind of income, some way of supporting themselves? Because not only did many of them find that they were unable to perform as they normally would have because of the shutdowns, but even in their other gigs, bars were closed, restaurants were closed, and so they were taking that hit on multiple fronts. And so one of the observations that I had is when cities are thinking, or administrations are thinking about how to make sure that we come out of the pandemic okay, we saw a lot of grant programs that were geared toward our large museums and large cultural institutions. There were grant opportunities and funding opportunities going to these entities, which is important. But the question then becomes, well, what do we do with the people who are actually creating the art? And so we cannot just focus on the venues or the institutions. We have to make sure that we're also providing those sorts of, whether it's grants, which are ideal, that can help artists continue to create, continue to do their art, so that they are actually around when the venues open, and so on and so forth. The other is mechanisms to provide the kind of assistance to these creators, because we did find that things became much more digital. So this question around, well, how do we, in a pandemic where we can't be in close proximity to each other, how do we digitalize our art? What does that look like? It depends whether you're a singer or playing instrument and audio technology versus if you're a performing artist, a dancer, and video technology. So this becomes an issue of accessibility. We have cities where there's a significant digital divide, meaning some areas have excellent access to Wi-Fi internet, other areas do not. Some areas have access to broadband, in other neighborhoods, typically neighborhoods that are marginalized, they do not. And so both from just your average resident who should have access to culture, what does that mean for them if they can't tap in or be on a Zoom or be on Instagram or any of the numerous things that we do online? And then for artists, what does it mean for them to have access to training to help them move their art into a digital framework, and hopefully even a digital framework where they can actually make money, where they can support themselves? So cities can assist, one, by addressing that digital divide and making sure that in all neighborhoods, people have access to broadband, have access to wireless internet, that children have access to computers, especially for school. But they can also help on the workforce side by corralling or bringing together experts in the technical field that can provide that kind of technical assistance to artists to help them move their art in ways that are necessary because of the pandemic, and in ways that will help them just evolve as an artist. So that digital component also becomes an issue of access. And then it was mentioned, I think Mirik mentioned earlier about education. That's incredibly important. We have situations where, when you think about education equity, where in the most underfunded schools, the first thing that gets cut are arts programs. So we, for whatever reason, and we have to grapple with this notion that art is a luxury. It is not, it's actually essential. It is essential to live a rich and full life. But because we tend to view art or the arts as a luxury, what happens is when it comes to policy decisions, it becomes something that is afforded only to those who can pay for it, or who can afford it, or who live in areas that can afford it, while other folks are completely marginalized. That is a long-standing issue. And so I always use the example of one of my favorite artists is Prince. I don't know how familiar folks are with Prince, but I mean, he played so many instruments. as a young person, as a teenager, in school. That's how he learned, the guitar, drums, all of these instruments that he plays. And I've always wondered what would we have gotten if Prince went to a high school that decided that it was just too expensive to keep the band program and the orchestra program, or that they could not invest or would not invest in a studio for young creatives. I mean, the world would just be so much darker if we had not had his brilliance. And so multiply that by millions around the world. So this becomes an opportunity for cities from a policy standpoint to actually say that we do believe that art is not just a luxury that's afforded to the wealthy, that it's not something that should only be included in schools that are in wealthier areas, and that it should not be the first thing on the chopping block when budgets get tight. Here in Chicago, some of the biggest artists to come out of Chicago credit programs that they were in when they were youth, that were in their school. So we have Chance the Rapper. He gives back now by doing open mic nights for high school students, because when he was in high school, he participated in these programs that taught young people you can get into the music studio. There were these poetry slams where they learned how to do spoken word. And of course, he's a rapper. So that's part of that kind of ecosystem. And now he's one of the biggest artists in the world. But imagine if he did not have that exposure. So this, I think that as we move forward in light of what the pandemic has exposed, it creates an additional mandate to put pressure on school boards, school districts, and city administrations to make sure that we are investing in these programs in our schools, but also in the park district or the neighborhood-based programs that are centered around the arts. And so that takes me to another point that I think is important to highlight, and that is the spatial considerations of access to culture. A lot of times with cities as they are planned, we have the central business district, if you will, or the downtown area. That's where, all of the best venues are, all of the shiny venues tend to be. It's when they have the pamphlets for tourists. That's where they tell everyone you've got to go here. And which is great. They generate a lot of money, a lot of publicity, a lot of reputational good for a city. But art isn't limited to downtown, and culture is not limited to downtown. And in fact, in a city like Chicago, for example, that is incredibly diverse, also incredibly segregated, but also it's a very strong neighborhood culture. So we have a neighborhood, Humboldt Park, that is Puerto Rican. So, and on any given day, it's, just a very strong Puerto Rican culture. If you go down to the South Side to Bronzeville, one of the strongest African-American communities where you see the culture, jazz, some of our music legends come out of Bronzeville. If you go to, there's so many pockets of culture that are completely outside of the downtown. And so for a city, the question is, how do we actually value the culture that comes out of the richness of our neighborhoods and the richness of the cultures that comprise the demographics or the population of our city? And what does that look like spatially? So when we are making investment decisions as a city, are we pooling all of our investments downtown? Or are we saying that we should actually be investing in supporting, creating, developing cultural institutions, venues that support the local culture in those neighborhoods? That's incredibly important, because for those who travel, like me, I'm not just gonna go to the downtown area. I wanna actually experience the richness of a city. And so when folks tell me they're coming to Chicago, go Millennium Park, check out the Bean, go to the Museum of Science and Industry, go to the Field Museum. But I'm going to tell you to go to 22nd Street if you want to get an experience of what Mexico is like. I'm going to tell you to go to Bronzeville. I'm going to tell you to go to Garfield Park if you want to see some of the best architecture. I'm going to tell you where you can go if you go to Devon Avenue on the north side. It's just like being in India. That's what I tell folks, because I know that that's the richness of the experience that they would get. And that kind of cultural exposure is valid. And the people in those neighborhoods deserve the same level of attention and investment so that they can continue to create their art in whatever form without having to go downtown or without having to only be plugged into the big institutions or the most publicized institutions. So in that sense, it does become an issue of making sure that everyone has the right to culture, everyone has the right to access, and that as a city, we create the kinds of support systems to support the infrastructure of culture, even outside of the downtown areas. And then the last piece that I wanted to kind of bring into this discussion is this notion of not just culture for whom, but also kind of tying it to development patterns. And I know gentrification came up. And I can recall we had some issues where communities, so going back to Humboldt Park, for example, it's a very strong Puerto Rican community. And on any given day in the summer, because we have short summers in Chicago, so we need to maximize, people will have, in Humboldt Park, they'll have like parties in their garage. So you just open the garage door, put some food, make some food, have some music. It might go into the night. It's the norm, right? It's folks bringing their culture from home, their home culture to the neighborhood. And what happened is, as gentrification happened, meaning some of these families were displaced, priced out, pushed out essentially from those neighborhoods, that these garage parties, which were just they're so ubiquitous, people who came into the community would then start calling the police on these residents who've been here for a very long time to complain about the garage parties, right? And so it can be seen as somewhat of a complicated issue, but it's important because culture isn't just the culture that we put on for consumption or the culture that we put on for people to see and enjoy. It's the way we are with each other. It is the way we interact with each other. And so this question of who has the right to culture and who gets access to culture, it's also in thinking about how culture can be either demonized or prioritized depending on the group that's in question. And in that instance, culture in that community that was the norm became a negative because of a population that came in that has a different culture. And so the question for cities to think about is, how do we grapple with that? Because the answer is not calling the police on folks doing garage parties. That's not the solution. And what that does is it says this culture is more valuable than that culture. Cities really have to take this into account when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about equity, and when we talk about justice. That's something that should undergird all of our policy decisions. It can't just be the money. It can't just be what's expedient or convenient. If we have an ethos that all of our residents are deserving of a high quality of life, then we have to care about justice. And that means thinking about how the city uses its agencies and its departments to either support culture, whether formal or informal, or to suppress. And when we take that frame, it allows us to develop policies that actually speak to the values that we claim around equity, diversity, and inclusion. So those are just some of the thoughts that I wanted to share with all of you.
Muchísimas gracias, Amara. Gracias por este statement tan convencido y tan entusiasta sobre la cultura y sobre los derechos culturales. A mí me gustaría volver, cuando estabas hablando de la importancia de la cultura, de considerar la cultura dentro de las políticas urbanas, me gustaría volver un poco a los análisis que habéis hecho de las ciudades, un poco de vuestras ciudades en la época COVID, del sector cultural en época COVID, y también relacionarlo esto con el espacio público. Entiendo que en los últimos, ya viene de antes, ya es anterior al COVID, cuando ya estábamos viendo en muchas ciudades y en muchos estados un movimiento general como de reducción progresiva de este espacio público, del espacio público como lugar de debate, como lugar de diálogo, como lugar de crítica, como lugar de protesta, como lugar de celebración, etcétera, etcétera. Y además, sumado a esto, la capa de la pandemia nos está dejando realmente un espacio público que cada vez está más regulado, que cada vez está más controlado, donde la libertad de movimientos, que es una de las libertades fundamentales, se ha puesto también en cuestión. A mí me gustaría saber cómo, una vez pasada esta, bueno, pasada, no está pasada, pero una vez la pandemia parece que está más o menos entre nosotros, pero más controlada y que podemos volver a ocupar los espacios públicos, ¿cómo aprendemos de la situación y cómo revertimos esta reducción del espacio público como un espacio de debate que está ocurriendo en muchos sitios? Y cómo desde la ocupación de ese espacio por parte de la cultura puede revertirse esa disminución del espacio público. Y cuando digo espacio público, voy a complicar la cuestión, también me gustaría añadirle el espacio digital, porque cuando tú hablabas, Amara, del espacio digital, y en el entorno del espacio digital, eso es un espacio esencialmente privado. Es muy público porque se comunica, pero está controlado, está de alguna manera controlado por espacios, por corporaciones privadas. Y eso también es cómo avanzar de alguna manera en esa ocupación del espacio público a partir de, por ejemplo, la actividad cultural, ¿no? Del derecho a la cultura, a la participación, al acceso, a la creación que tienen todos los ciudadanos en las ciudades. Diego, a lo mejor puedes ayudarnos un poco aquí.
Sí, yo tenía como cosas que añadir, porque, bueno, aparte que nos atraviesa de manera muy directa, pero cuando también nos habéis planteado un poco como esta reflexión, un poco de plantearnos esa reflexión en torno al espacio público en la era post-COVID, pues claro, nos han surgido muchas preguntas, ¿no? O sea, y nos hemos planteado muchas cosas. O sea, y de hecho también nos hacíamos como esta pregunta de cuál era esa especie de nuevo derecho, o cuál es el derecho cultural incluso en este contexto. Y como una vez más nosotros como lo ligamos también más que el derecho cultural, hablando de espacio público, lo ligamos al derecho a la ciudad, ¿no? O sea, que viene como muy atravesado y viene como directamente como vinculado, o debería estar directamente vinculado, ¿no? O sea, porque realmente, bueno, ahora mismo en la etapa COVID, ya no sé si es post o COVID o con lo que sea, o sea, pues bueno, se han visibilizado pues algunas cuestiones, como por ejemplo cuáles son estos espacios públicos que tenemos y las calidades de esos espacios públicos o los accesos a esos espacios públicos dependiendo de tu nivel de ingresos o dependiendo de tu espacio, tu barrio, tu lugar de residencia, que no todos estos barrios tienen los mismos espacios públicos ni las mismas calidades a los espacios públicos, ¿no? Esto se visibiliza, o sea, justo ahora porque muchos nos hemos planteado que las viviendas incluso también no tienen las cualidades para estar también en estos momentos de pandemia, cuando está todo el mundo encerrado, pues muchas veces el espacio público era el lugar donde, o sea, podías desarrollar lo que no podías, o sea, o lo que no tenías dentro de tu vivienda, por las carencias que sean. El espacio público también se convierte también como ese lugar un poco de revertir o intentar un poco como plantear un poco equilibrar esos desequilibrios que ya existen, o sea, a nivel estructural por las diferencias de clase o a nivel un poco también estructural en cuanto un poco a la diferencia de calidades, de ingresos y demás, o sea, y al final un poco de la vivienda, ¿no? De cómo es tu modelo de vivienda en el que resides. Entonces, bueno, el espacio público en este caso yo creo que debería estar como planteándose, o las administraciones también un poco, o las instituciones, cuando hablamos un poco de ese derecho a la ciudad y ese derecho cultural, pues bueno, lógicamente hay también como una tarea muy grande dentro del espacio público en sí mismo para poder cubrir un poco como esas desigualdades, ¿no? O sea, que están como que son claras, ¿no? O sea, para mí un poco, cuando estamos hablando de temas de acceso dentro un poco a nivel cultural, dentro del espacio público, el acceso más allá un poco de la cuestión más economicista, de poder acceder o no por tu capacidad, por tu... también hablan un poco de otros elementos como también son como tus contenidos, tus posibilidades, o sea, otros parámetros que habría que poner también un poco en el debate, ¿no? Y para poder un poco reflexionar de la cultura en el espacio público no es una cuestión de que porque esté en el espacio público ya significa que tengas como un acceso o una posibilidad de acceso, ¿no? Aquí también estabas un poco hablando pues del momento del espacio público digital. Pues esto mismo lo llevamos a la brecha digital, o lo llevamos a las carencias de acceso de mucha población que no puede acceder por recursos y por medios a medios tecnológicos, o no puede acceder incluso a determinados lugares de la ciudad porque no tienen los recursos económicos para poder desplazarse, para poder moverse, para poder llegar a esos centros de las ciudades donde existen como todos estos contenidos que a priori son gratuitos y son públicos y accesibles, pero no todos pueden tener un poco como esos privilegios. Entonces, yo creo que cuando hacemos una reflexión en este sentido, pues tendríamos que también un poco como estar también pensando en estas otras cosas, ¿no? O sea, por un lado, estos temas como muy estructurales que van marcando un poco las posibilidades de lo que pueden ser los derechos los derechos culturales dentro del espacio público, porque vienen condicionados por esa cuestión un poco de tu condición, ¿no? de dónde vienes, o sea, y por otro lado también elementos, o sea, que pueden posibilitar o aportar el desarrollo de actividades concretas que a lo mejor no existen. Yo también a mí me surgía como otra cosa, que era muchas veces, o sea, los espacios públicos que están dotados, un parque, una plaza o cualquier otro lugar, pues muchas veces, hay veces que tenemos ratios y tenemos como elementos que digan, bueno, yo tengo un lugar, tengo un sitio, pero el lugar y el sitio no es solo suficiente, ¿no? Que hay veces que, por ejemplo, un acceso a un punto de luz, un acceso a un wifi, como tú hablabas, o sea, como se comentaba aquí, es muy importante para un desarrollo de una actividad dentro del espacio público. Entonces, algo como tan intangible como son los elementos infraestructurales que te permitan o que te posibilitan el desarrollo de una actividad dentro del espacio público, sin tener que tener un generador, sin tener que tener como una infraestructura muy compleja, eso, o sea, posibilita esos derechos a la ciudad o esos derechos culturales que, bueno, con muy pocos elementos se podrían un poco como revertir diferentes situaciones que se generan un poco precisamente por no estar equipados los espacios públicos de esta manera, ¿no? O sea, por no tener como esos instrumentos o esas posibilidades para desarrollar. Y luego, bueno, a mí se estaba comentando mucho el tema de la gentrificación cuando se estaba como hablando anteriormente. O sea, creo que esto también está un poco ligado a eso, ¿no? Cuando los espacios son diversos, son inclusivos, cuando el derecho a la ciudad está como permitida, lógicamente, o sea, esos procesos de gentrificación están de alguna manera controlados por la propia masa crítica de la ciudadanía que se posiciona frente a estas cuestiones, y precisamente cuando un espacio público tiene unas cualidades que te permiten acceder de una manera en igualdad de condiciones al ciudadano, probablemente podamos frenar un poco con lo que sería un poco esa cuestión un poco de la gentrificación o ese problema de la gentrificación que también nos ataca mucho en este sentido.
Gracias. Clara, creo que querías intervenir, veía tu cabeza diciendo sí, cuando estábamos hablando de la reducción del espacio público, de la reducción de ese espacio, de esa ágora de debate, de diálogo, de celebración y de crítica, ¿no? ¿Querías intervenir ahí?
Yes, absolutely. Sure. So in the UK, I think grassroots music venues are quite unusual in that 83% of venues are privately owned, so they have a private landlord. And that's unique in the UK's cultural space because theatres and art centres tend to be publicly owned or they're owned by local councils. And so at Music Venue Trust, our next big campaign is called Own Our Venues. We think it's really important that the local community who use these venues own these venues because At the moment, private landlords have no interest in keeping these venues as music venues. They would really actually rather have them nearly anything other than a music venue. And if given the chance, they'd probably rather have them demolished and built as flats or developments. But in the UK, we want to create cultural parity. The people who use these grassroots music venues, this is their access point to culture, and they're just as culturally valid as theatres or public museums or anything like that. And so in the UK, there's a mechanism where the community can buy these buildings, so community pubs, community art spaces, things like that. And so our next big campaign is to do that, and is to raise money to bring music venues into public protection, and so that in the long term, these threats of development are mitigated, and essentially we can create kind of cultural equality across different art forms and different cultural forms. I think it will help create a lot of long-term benefits for these spaces, because when you consider things like sustainability, increasing accessibility, things like disability rights, at the moment it's very difficult to implement those policies into our spaces because the people running these spaces don't own the freehold of these buildings. Any improvements they make to the building is an improvement they're making to their private landlord. And so unless we address that kind of core structural issue, it really prolongs our ability to focus on all of these other things that we need to improve in our sector. And so I think, at least in the UK, I know Europe is actually a lot further ahead than we are in terms of music venues being public spaces and publicly owned or owned by the community. And so we're really looking at case studies from Europe and other countries that have already done this, and we're going to try and implement that here in the UK. And I think it's time that the communities who use these venues own these venues, and we can bring them into public protection.
Mirik, a lo mejor queríais, gracias Clara, a lo mejor querías hacer algún comentario sobre lo que la pregunta, sobre la pandemia, sobre la reducción del espacio público y del acceso al espacio y la posibilidad del acceso al espacio público desde la cultura, y sobre todo de la defensa de ese lugar común que es el espacio público para la actividad cultural. No sé si quieres entrar por ahí. Y si no, también tengo otra pregunta para ti, que sería el tema de la gobernanza. ¿Cómo, desde la experiencia que tenéis en la Alcaldía de Noche, cómo manejáis con la gobernanza? Porque ha salido varias veces, ha salido ahora mismo en la propuesta de Clara. Tú también hablabas de temas de gobernanza. ¿Cómo fue la gestión de la gobernanza con los distintos locales, con las distintas actividades y organizaciones que están ocupando el espacio nocturno?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I very much enjoyed all the input that has been given, and I want to refer quickly to what Amara was saying when it comes to the ecosystem. These ecosystems are so important for having a vibrant scene, and this is also where we meet new people, where we share ideas, and where we really come together. And those ecosystems is really what shape the identity of our cities. But also referring to what Clara was saying when it comes to these music venues publicly owned, because when a music venue is publicly owned, that gives possibilities to program it also, to program it in a certain way. And then the question is, of course, how do we make sure that this programming is equitable and inclusive to many operators? And there, the city can have a role in making sure that that there's a that the booking team is diverse, that the people that are working, the staff that are working behind the bar, but also that the partners that are connected to these music venues come from a diverse background. So, and that really would, I think, really make sure that also in the end, the people that are coming through the door are also from all backgrounds and all ages and genders. I think it's really interesting to look at the city in a different way. And when it comes to governance, a big issue which I've seen a lot in my work is that when there's an issue in the city, the first reaction of the police is to, or the city government is to say, okay, we have to stop this now, instead of bringing all the stakeholders together and trying to find a solution that actually works for everyone. Because we do these things also during the day in our streets, and we need to make sure that this is happening everywhere. But I also understand, because it's very difficult to penetrate the city's nightlife from your office in City Hall. So really getting out of City Hall and really knowing what is happening in neighborhoods, what is happening on the ground, because nightlife really is about, you can change it like street by street, and it's not something, that you wave your magic wand around and you change it all. It really starts by working together with the nightlife operators, but also with the city residents, and come up with these solutions. But I think it's really important that there's always a trade-off of some sort. You need to also offer something to nightlife operators for them to invest in the neighborhood. You need to make sure that all stakeholders also benefit from the fact that this music venue is there. And one of the examples that we have done in Amsterdam is we introduced 24-hour licensed venues. These venues were not located in the city center. So as Amara was referring to, why is all the investment always going into downtown or going into the city center? Why don't we think about creating new city centers or creating new areas and investing in them? And that's what we did with the 24-hour licenses. They were not you couldn't apply for them in the city center. They were only in the outskirts, in areas that still needed to be developed. And by giving these extended opening hours, that gave opportunities for nightlife for these operators to also approach the venue with a more multidisciplinary approach. So they would have they would have a bar, gallery, co-working space. Some of them even had a gym that is open 24-hour, or there's even one that also has a kindergarten. So using buildings in different way, thinking about, okay, what are also the needs for the residents that live around these venues, so that they also benefit from the fact that the venue is there, and not that it's only just like, the whole week it's two big black doors, and in the weekend there's a lot of people going in and out, and there's noise and disturbance, and there's maybe and there's a lot of taxis in front of the door. So how do you really make it into a community space that everyone benefits from, and that also makes those neighborhoods more makes those neighborhoods more interesting and vibrant for everyone that lives there. So rounding up, when it comes to governance, it's really about making sure that your voice is heard and that you're part of the conversation, and that we approach it from a multi-stakeholder approach, and not only letting police and city government decide what's important for our neighborhoods.
Gracias, Mirik. Creo que es tiempo ahora un poco de abrir turno de preguntas del público. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, o quizás por online hay alguna cuestión. Lo digo porque estamos hablando constantemente sobre el diálogo entre distintos agentes, organizaciones, ciudadanos, artistas, asociaciones, propietarios de locales, etcétera. Me gustaría un poco ver si hay alguna pregunta específica. Por ahora no veo preguntas específicas. ¿Sí? ¿Hay alguna? Muy bien.
Hola. Sí. Tenemos algunas preguntas del streaming de YouTube. La primera pregunta era para Diego y pregunta Carlos, desde tu experiencia, ¿cuáles han sido los principales obstáculos que impone el poder para el ejercicio de los derechos culturales en el territorio?
una preguntaza. O sea, bueno, fundamentalmente el control. O sea, el control un poco de los intereses tanto públicos, políticos y económicos, ¿no? O sea, porque prácticamente un poco cuando practicas o planteas una actividad que desborda o que está fuera un poco de los intereses que se marcan por determinadas políticas públicas o por determinados intereses, pues lógicamente existe una necesidad de controlarlo o de contraponerlo, ¿no? Entonces, muchas veces cuando estás como planteando un poco como o estás lanzando una posibilidad de dar como un espacio, ya sea un movimiento, yo estoy hablando de movimientos alternativos, independientes, o sea, que están intentando a lo mejor plantear alguna actividad, alguna acción o posicionarse dentro del espacio público, ya que estamos hablando de espacio público, frente a determinadas cuestiones. Entonces, la cuestión que yo me planteo desde ese lugar siempre ha sido un poco como esa necesidad de controlar, ¿no? Esa necesidad antes lo hablábamos, ¿no? de normalizar, que muchas veces, claro, todas estas prácticas, cuando intentas como negociar con la propia administración, lógicamente te confrontas a todo un aparataje burocrático que te imposibilita su desarrollo, porque prácticamente en la mayor parte de las veces es discrecional cuando se toman decisiones políticas, ¿no? Entonces, no son decisiones, no hay herramientas y no hay instrumentos que te permitan, más allá un poco de plantear algunas de las acciones que planteas, o sea, entrar por un canal que sea equitativo, que sea realmente valorado desde otro lugar, que no sea una valoración estrictamente política, ¿no? En muchos casos, ¿no?
Sí, ¿nadie de la sala tiene?
Hay una pregunta aquí.
Thank you. You mentioned bringing culture to people who may not have access to it. And in light of Aymara's comments, which I really appreciated, I just wondered if how open Barcelona and the city government is to celebrating the cultures of, its huge immigrant working classes. If you go to Sant Adria and areas like that, the narrative of Barcelona sort of tends to fray a little because there's very little celebration of the cultures of the immigrant working classes. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. I mean, is there any place where, people can go to in the city government to get access to public spaces to celebrate their individual cultures?
No sé, no hay nadie del Ayuntamiento de Barcelona aquí para responderte quizás a esta pregunta, pero es una pregunta que yo considero que es absolutamente pertinente, sobre todo porque tanto en la mirada sobre el pasado, ya vemos en los debates, en muchísimas ciudades del mundo se está repensando cuáles son los monumentos, cuáles son los patrimonios que se celebran, etcétera, etcétera, si estos son realmente representativos de lo contemporáneo, de la situación, de los habitantes de las ciudades y de la gente que está en las ciudades, o si son patrimonios que están impuestos y que necesitan repensarse en nuevas narrativas. Por ejemplo, esto es una de las cosas que se está repensando en algunas ciudades. En otras ciudades también se está repensando. Sí que es cierto que se habla siempre de la cultura, pero creo que deberíamos aquí utilizar un plural, pues son las culturas. En todo caso, no es una cultura la que existe, sino diversas culturas que pueden confluir. Pero bueno, yo no soy Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, yo soy moderadora, por lo tanto, a lo mejor alguien quiere contestar. Amara, Mirik, Diego o Clara.
Sí, bueno, yo O sea, para hacer una actividad, cualquier ciudadano puede solicitar. Yo no soy de Barcelona, pero en Madrid, o sea, cualquier entidad que quiera desarrollar alguna actividad dentro del espacio público, hay unos canales para solicitar el permiso de actividad, lo que hablamos, un permiso de actividad de la que sea dentro del espacio público. Las limitaciones son un poco estas, que ya cada entidad y cada organización tiene que tener los recursos para poder desarrollar esa actividad, ¿no? Y eso sería un poco como otra cara B de esta cuestión. Pero prácticamente un poco no existe una limitación, o sea, simplemente no existe una limitación de la solicitud, simplemente existe como una limitación de los formatos, ¿no? O sea, en función un poco de tu actividad, del número de gente, de cómo se organiza una propuesta, o sea, tienes unos requisitos, ¿no? para cumplir un poco de cara un poco a lo que te solicita la administración pública, ¿no? O sea, que necesitas cubrir como determinados elementos, pues en algunos momentos tienes que perimetrar un lugar, en otros momentos tienes que contar con unos medios como tipo ambulancias, medios auxiliares, depende un poco del número de gente, o sea, del número de personas que están convocadas para un desarrollo de actividad. Pero no son reguladores del perfil de la actividad, no te determinan qué actividades entran o no, sino te determinan en función de un poco de lo cuantitativo qué elementos necesitas para desarrollar esa actividad.
Creo que hay alguna respuesta por...
Sí.
¿Una intervención?
Vale, sí. Bueno, yo soy Daniel Granado, soy delegado de Derechos Culturales del Ayuntamiento de Barcelona y no he acabado de oír la pregunta porque estaba justo contestando un tema de trabajo, pero entiendo que tiene que ver con el uso del espacio público para la cultura y cómo eso se relaciona también con la interculturalidad y con el reconocimiento de minorías que no siempre tienen el acceso al espacio público. Hay una idea de fondo que yo creo que sobrevolaba también en lo que decían varias de las personas que están participando, y es la tensión que hay entre una serie de espacios que están muy significados, muy reconocidos y muy regulados, que tienen que ver precisamente con el patrimonio, digamos, hegemónico, ortodoxo, que está históricamente trabajado en las ciudades y en Barcelona específicamente, ¿no? Y muy vinculado también con las grandes instituciones culturales, ¿no? Pero hay otro patrimonio del que no se habla y que tiene que ver precisamente con el uso cultural, seguramente no de la cultura hegemónica o no de la cultura que siempre se entiende, pero sí que con las prácticas culturales, ¿no? Es un patrimonio ordinario que sin duda hace falta trabajar desde una perspectiva también de la norma, ¿no? Y cuando hablo del patrimonio ordinario, hablo del espacio público y del espacio público facilitando recursos, como pueden ser unos enchufes, como pueden ser unas sillas y como pueden ser una serie de elementos que son absolutamente imprescindibles para que esas comunidades lo puedan utilizar. Hay que decir que muchas veces esas comunidades tampoco piden permiso, por suerte, para poderlo utilizar y resignifican ese espacio público como una práctica, diría, contracultural también, ¿no? Y sin duda las administraciones tienen que dar respuesta a esas necesidades si tienen una apuesta clara y decidida por reconocer los derechos culturales, ¿no? Yo creo que el proyecto de Barcelona, de Superilla Barcelona, en el fondo tiene mucho que ver con eso, ¿no? Cómo generar un nuevo patrimonio de la ciudad que sea ordinario, que reconozca las prácticas cotidianas y ordinarias y que facilite la vida. Es un hardware, si queréis, que necesita de un software que es la práctica cultural de la ciudadanía. No siempre programada por las instituciones o por los proyectos culturales, sino también, como decía Diego antes, por la propia ciudadanía. Y esa tensión entre las prácticas, las instituciones y el espacio público es imprescindible para entender un proyecto como Superilla Barcelona y para desarrollar los derechos culturales. Por lo tanto, no es una respuesta, digamos, concreta a la demanda, pero sí es una reflexión que quería dejar porque es un camino que como mínimo hace falta plantearlo y andarlo, ¿no?
Gracias, Daniel. Sí, es cierto que la política cultural no son las culturas, sino las culturas están y la política cultural lo que tiene que hacer es proporcionar esa infraestructura, esa estructura para que eso ocurra. Creo que había otra pregunta. ¿Hay otra pregunta? Sí. ¿Por aquí, el público? ¿O aquí hay otra pregunta?
Hello, I have a question for both Amara and Mirik, and I'd like to, you referred to that briefly, but I think there is something quite important in what you're explaining, which is this trade-off or difficult balance between control and creating the framework to allow things to happen, to program or that just creating the conditions for culture, as well for governing or just letting things go. So I would like this tension of control or creating the framework to allowing, and also of governing or letting things go, and at the same time trying to do that in the framework of becoming more inclusive or more representative of diversity of the city. I don't know, how are you solving this trade-off, which is very difficult?
Who wants to go first? Mirik?
Yes, so thank you for your question. So, for example, sometimes a decision is being made just because of this underbelly feeling that probably it will all go wrong. There's a lot of people that actually say like nothing ever good happens after midnight. And of course, I don't agree with this. So, for example, when it came to the 24-hour licenses that we helped to create, it was very clear to the mayor of Amsterdam that if he wanted to move forward with the city, and if you wanted to make it more safe, but also more vibrant at night, you had to come up with a solution that actually benefits both sides. And really often people think that so it was a pilot project. It started in 2013. After 5 years, there was an evaluation. And what came out of the independent report created by the city of Amsterdam is that, in fact, having longer opening hours actually meant that there was less pressure on the neighborhood. Because what happens usually, or what happens everywhere in the world, is that when people leave, they all leave at the same time. So whether your curfew is 2 a.m., 4 a.m., or 6 a.m., all the patrons, they all leave at the same time. And actually this is what is creating the most problems. So if you have the opportunity to stay open the whole night, then you see that people also leave they don't leave in those big numbers. So they slowly leave. And also you have an option, as a security staff or as the venue owner, you have the option to say, well, either you go inside or you go home, but you're not going to hang outside in front of the door making a mess and making noise, because really often, or at least in Amsterdam, a music venue can't create disturbance like when in operation. So there's sound limits, there's sound isolation, and that is we are lucky enough to have all these that Amsterdam is so rich that you can make those investments and into sound isolation. So really, the approach of the city of Amsterdam and the night mayor role is not just to let things go. It's just to better organize it. It's to better organize it and really think about, okay, what are the options that we have, and how can we do it in a way that it minimizes complaints and impact, but it has a positive effect. But clearly, that's also why these venues could not be in the city center, because the city center is already overcrowded with tourism. Same as in Barcelona, it's too busy, And the bigger problem is that mass tourism is actually a bigger problem than nightlife. That is what really leads to, and that flow of mass tourism that won't stop. So the issues that a lot of city residents have in the inner city is more due to all the tiny bits of issues that they are facing, instead of one big problem. And you see a lot of city residents, they like to switch the knob, because like nightlife or a nightlife venue or a music venue, that is something big they can do to cut away the disturbance. But it won't stop all the tourists coming down the street with their little carry-on luggage and all the other things that they are causing.
I just wanted to throw in, and I am not and will never be the tourist with my carry-on luggage coming down the street, for the record. But I appreciate that explanation. I mean, it really is something that really speaks to the heart of this issue of control and what the city can do versus what they can't do. And just to make the point that sometimes I think cities have to understand that the cultural elements don't necessarily need to be absorbed by the city. I think sometimes cities position themselves to where they either absorb a thing and then want complete control over it, or they are completely disinterested or completely disconnected from it. And so there has to be a space where cities can, administrations can can help to create an environment that's conducive for whatever is happening to happen. That might mean making sure that a venue is quality or has upgrades, or can investing in some improvements perhaps in the venue, or it might be just investing in the pipeline for artists who perform in these venues that are in these other areas. It's not all the time that the city has to completely control and absorb cultural elements. And I think sometimes that's the goal, especially if it's something that might be popular or they may see some sort of revenue from it. They want to take it over essentially and control it. And sometimes that actually diminishes what is actually being created. So for cities, it's about knowing your role, like knowing the role that the city should play and the city can play. And to Mirik's point, mitigating obviously liabilities or dangerous circumstances, of course, that's a role that the city can play. But cities also have to be very cognizant that they don't overstep to the point where they're actually inhibiting the culture from being able to be produced or from being able to be experienced around the city.
Thank you, Amara. Tenemos tiempo de recoger otra pregunta de internet, quizás. Una más, quizá.
YouTube.
YouTube.
Rosario has a specific question for Amara. She would like to know if you could please share some of the specific actions that are currently happening in Chicago, and what are the benefits to the artists and the communities involved.
Sure. So there were a few things that happened in Chicago, particularly last year at the onset of the pandemic. But I will say there is definitely room for improvement and to do more. So one of the things that happened is Chicago, just thinking about this spatially, what people can do and how to support artists, moved a lot of things outdoors. It meant outdoor venues became much more important. It meant that making space on our streets. So some streets that were for driving were actually converted to non-drivable streets. So they were only open now to be places for gathering for the community. Only pedestrian traffic was allowed, no vehicles. That was a huge shift that took place that Chicago initiated in the last year. And in fact, even as things open up, some of those protected spaces still exist. The city did invest in creating more outdoor seating areas, not necessarily for the sole purpose of performances, but just areas that were kind of open spaces. So they're new chairs or places where people can sit now. And so if there is, for example, an impromptu performance, a street performer that's performing, people can actually sit down and enjoy, as opposed to just being able to stand. So that's another specific thing that the city of Chicago did. When it came to artists, we did see a lot of grant programs that were developed, and this was done in conjunction with private philanthropy, as well as cultural institutions, really pulling together to make sure that artists could be supported financially, especially at the height of when the city was being locked down. And so that looked like grants that were going directly to artists to make sure that they could sustain themselves through the course of the pandemic when the lockdowns were in place. And so those were some of the specific things that needed to happen. Now there's, I think, a lot more that needs to happen in terms of making sure that our public parks and green spaces are of the highest quality, particularly in neighborhoods on the south side of the city, on the west side of the city, because public parks and those public spaces become places for art. They're used in so many different ways. It's not just folks going there to jog in the morning or walk their dog. They're places for, people to play their instruments, singers, dancers, photographers, so much that is happening. And so the city can definitely do more to make sure that these spaces are high quality. Also from an education standpoint, that investment in the schools is very real. It's one thing that I think the city has missed the mark on, is making sure that the schools are adequately, have adequate resources to make sure that arts is still vibrant, even if children are learning remotely, whether they're learning remotely or in person. So the city did a few concrete things well last year to adjust, to make sure that we could still have a vibrant cultural life. But there are also some things that I think they can definitely do better, especially as we look forward in this pandemic being not just a very finite thing, but might be something that is ongoing.
Thank you. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta online, para la gente que está online o presencial?
Quedan varias en YouTube.
Quedan varias
pero
online.
Si solo tenemos tiempo para una más.
Arranca otra. Voy a estirar un poco el tiempo. Pon otra.
Jorge pregunta qué herramientas existen o fueron creadas para disminuir el aumento de los alquileres de locales nocturnos. Es decir, si los alquileres de los locales nocturnos han subido, ¿qué herramientas hay para reducirlo?
Es una pregunta dirigida...
No lo he especificado.
¿Clara? ¿Mirik?
Sí.
¿Diego?
Yo de locales nocturnos no... O sea...
No sé si Mirik han tenido esa experiencia, probablemente sí, de aumento del precio de los locales, de alquiler de los locales en Ámsterdam, Londres.
Yeah, so sometimes really often, oh, sorry, my apologies. Sometimes really or often, you know, it's seen that nightlife is also part of a gentrification process. And for sure, that's true. The question is, what does the city do to keep like, you know, this creative space in that area? I feel that, you know, really often cities use nightlife as a tool for gentrification by giving out short-term leases of 2 to 3 years. And I think it's really like, or in my belief, I think by investing and keeping a nightlife venue in a certain district, that's a long-term investment, because once that money is transferred, or once that building is transferred, as Clara was mentioning, these private landlords, once it's transferred, it also sucks out the value that it has for this area. So what our goal is really to really make the city aware, like, yeah, buying the property, that is always, in my opinion, the best solution. But what you also see is, for example, a practice from Berlin, where the city is actually investing in sound isolation. So they have so the soundproofing fund. It's 2 million euros a year. And venues can get up to 50K per venue to invest in their soundproofing, maybe to change an exit from one side to the other side of the building, or to invest in the quality of the speakers. So that is a solution that can help to protect the venue from being there. When it comes to, of course, to gentrification, our approach is always try to keep the venue in that space, in that area, as long as possible, but because in the long term it will keep the neighborhood more diverse and more interesting to live in the end.
Thank you, Mirik. En el chivato me salen muchos signos rojos que tenemos que estar acabando, así que daría por acabada esta sesión. Thank you so much, Clara, Mirik, Amara, for your insights. Muchísimas gracias, Diego. Y bueno, esperamos que la sesión nos haya inspirado un poco para aplicar mejores políticas culturales. Muchas gracias a todos y hasta la próxima.